The year begins not with celebration, but with silence. You awaken before the frost has thawed from the rafters of your shared, straw-floored hut. In Flanders, in the year 1281, the wind does not ask permission before it slips through your thatched roof and into your bones. Your family is huddled together like spoons. You do not own your land, your house, or even, technically, yourself. You are a serf, not quite a slave, but far from free. This first quarter of the year, from January to March, is the cruelest. The ground is frozen. The days are short, and so are the tempers. The pantry, once full after the autumn harvest, now holds little more than dried peas, a few onions, and hard bread that can cut your gums. You chew slowly not from leisure but because it hurts less that way. There is no such thing as a day off. Even in winter, there are endless tasks: feeding the pigs, hauling frozen buckets of water from the distant communal well, cutting firewood for your lord's manor before tending to your own hearth. Most humiliating of all is boon work, unpaid labor done specifically for your lord, often on short notice. If he needs a ditch dug in January or a fence mended in snow, you go. And you must not forget, taxes. The idea of a tax season is laughable to you. Taxes never end. You owe a portion of your grain to the Lord, a portion of your eggs to the priest, and a portion of your soul to God, who, it seems, takes a particular interest in testing peasants. In the frozen fields, when the sun reluctantly rises past the fog, you and your fellow serfs take to pruning vines, sharpening tools, and inspecting the brittle fences. Your hands are red and raw. Gloves exist, but not for you. Illness is ever present. In February, a child from your neighbor's hovel develops a cough that turns to wheezing, then silence. There is no doctor, only the village wise woman, who mutters Latin-rooted prayers and rubs garlic into the boy's chest. He dies anyway. His body is wrapped in a flax sheet and buried behind the church without ceremony. You help dig the shallow grave, not out of friendship, but because your own son might need the same one day, and the favor will be returned. Even the church offers little warmth. Sunday Mass is mandatory, regardless of weather. You sit on cold wooden benches while Father Willem drones in Latin. You do not understand a word. But you bow your head, mumble your own prayers, and hope that God sees your humility. Yet not all is suffering. There is quiet comfort in routine. The clink of your wooden spoon in the porridge bowl. The laughter of children chasing chickens in the snow. Your wife mending a tunic by firelight, her fingers as skilled as any craftsman in the manor. The arrival of Lent in early March means more fasting, as if that's a change. You joke with your brother that the church picked the one time of year peasants can't break a fast. Fish replaces meat, but only if you can catch it. Your wife attempts to trap eels in the stream using a woven basket. You manage to boil 2 of them. It tastes like mud and grease, but it's something warm. The thaw is coming. Slowly, the ground softens, the trees exhale their first sap, and the sky shifts from slate to something resembling blue. You ready your tools for plowing. Your arms ache not from the work ahead, but from the work behind. Spring does not promise plenty, only possibility. 1,000 things can still go wrong. And always, the steward arrives on the 1st of April, carrying scrolls and lists. He does not speak much, but his presence alone asks the question that haunts you: the frost is gone, but now the real work begins. By early April, your body is not rested but conditioned. The muscles in your back remember the exact pressure of the yoke. The calluses on your hands have grown over last year's blisters. You're not alone in this rhythm. All across your village, and across thousands of villages like it, serfs rise. With the light and collapse with the dusk. This season is planting, and planting is everything. The soil is no longer frozen, but that doesn't mean it welcomes the plow. You and your brother team up to drag the heavy wooden art across the land, its iron tip scraping clumsily at the topsoil. There are no oxen. The Lord's beasts are reserved for his own fields. You are the ox. Every day is a race against rain, not to avoid it, but to use it. If the seeds aren't in the ground in time, you will curse the sky when the spring showers arrive. If you plant too late, the summer sun will burn your grain before it's grown. Every step in this process is a bet against nature, and nature holds all the cards. You sow barley, rye, beans, and cabbage. Not because you want variety, but because you need insurance. If the barley fails, maybe the beans will survive. Your wife plants herbs near the hovel, not for flavor, but for medicine. You bury dried fish scraps beneath the roots for luck. In May, the sun climbs higher, and so do your anxieties. The steward returns. This time, he brings scales and iron weights. It is time to pay in advance for the land you work. You offer grain from last year's store, he weighs it, scowls, then scratches something onto a wax tablet. It is never enough. You are now in debt. Again. You sign your name with an X, even though you cannot read. You ask what the steward has written beside it. He doesn't answer. He doesn't have to. That night, your wife boils a broth of bitter greens. You eat it slowly, watching the last light disappear through the cracks in the wall. You try not to think about the steward's ledger. But it's there, in the pit of your stomach, heavy and sour. By June, the village is a hive of sweat and motion. You work from sunrise to moonrise. You break your fast with thin ale and rye bread, and you break your back with stones and weeds. The worst task is clearing the Lord's pasture. The nettles sting through your shirt, and the mud swallows your boots. You say nothing. Complaints are wasted words. And yet, rebellion simmers in silence. It's in the glance your cousin gives when the steward's back is turned. It's in the extra ladle of milk passed quietly to an elder who can no longer work. It's in the gathering under the elder oak tree, where men whisper about harvest yields and whether the Lord might be tricked into accepting hollow grain sacks stuffed with straw. But nothing is said aloud. There are always ears. And the stocks in the village square are never empty. In July, the heat becomes cruel. Your skin peels. Blisters form on top of blisters. You sleep less, and when you do, your dreams are filled with the whine of mosquitoes and the thump of wooden tools. The fields are buzzing with insects, and the crops are alive, but so are the weeds, and so are the rats. The rats, in particular, worry you. They've gotten bolder. You see them dart between sacks in the granary, chewing holes through the bottom of the bags. You set traps, but they're clever. They return. Always. Your youngest child comes down with a rash. The wise woman says it's heat pox. She mixes a poultice from nettle and clay, and it seems to help. But then a neighbor's daughter begins to cough. You've seen that cough before. You say nothing. August arrives, and with it, anticipation. The grain heads have turned gold, the beans are fat on the stalk, and the cabbages are near bursting. But the pressure builds. The harvest must be done quickly, efficiently, and, most importantly, the Lord's portion must be collected first. Harvest season is both a celebration and a curse. There's singing, yes, and moments of laughter. Children play in the sheaves. Women braid flowers into their hair. But all of it is under the gaze of the steward, who counts every sack of grain and every basket of beans. Your family is allowed to keep only what remains after the tithe, to the manor, to the church, and sometimes to the guild, in the nearest town. You are paid in leftovers. That night, your wife cries quietly. Not out of despair, but exhaustion. You sit beside her in silence, counting what's left in the corner of the room. It will be enough, maybe. If no one gets sick. If the winter is kind. If the rats don't find the grain again. But all of that is out of your hands. And as you stare at the stars through the holes in your roof, you begin to wonder. Is this the life God intended for those who till the earth with their own bodies? The harvest is done. The air has changed. September arrives not with fanfare, but with a hush. The fields are bare now, stubble and broken stems stretching in all directions. The hayricks are stacked, the root cellars packed, and the granary doors locked, not by you, but by the steward. The Lord's portion sits under wax seals, protected not by divine right, but by iron ones. And yet, it is in these final months, when your body is the most broken and your spirit most tested, that your fate for the coming year is decided. The food is measured carefully. Each day you portion out bread no thicker than your thumb. The beans must last through February. The salted pork, if you were lucky enough to have a pig slaughtered, is already growing white crystals of salt along its skin. You cannot afford to eat it yet. Not now. Not when there's still the festival of St. Martin in November and Christmas beyond that. You chew slowly. You learn to enjoy bitterness. Sour apples. Fermented cabbage. Onion tops. Hunger is no longer a sensation. It's a backdrop to your existence. Your body begins to hurt in new places. Your wife develops a limp in her right foot, the result of a badly healed injury from hauling wood. She tries not to let it show. Your eldest son spends more time sitting in the corner. He says he is tired. You worry it's something else. The days shrink. The nights stretch out like long, empty roads. You repair thatch with frozen fingers. You barter 3 turnips for a candle stub. You chase a chicken into the forest and almost don't come back. And yet, this is also the most holy time of the year. October is filled with feasts, for saints, for angels, and for the dead. You attend Mass more often. You kneel in the cold chapel, your knees sinking into the stone. You listen as Father Willem reads aloud from the Book of Hours. You still don't understand the Latin. But when he speaks of sin, of patience, of the suffering of Christ, it somehow makes sense. The stories told around the fire now shift from practical to spiritual. You listen to tales of villagers long gone, of men who were taken by the woods, of women who vanished after seeing strange lights, of children who followed a piper out of the village and never returned. Superstition and scripture blur. The devil has many names, and even more disguises. By November, the weather turns cruel again. Rain becomes sleet. Sleet becomes snow. Your boots leak. Your hut is damp. Mold grows between the wall planks. A neighbor's chimney collapses in a storm. 2 families now share one hearth. The feast of St. Martin is supposed to bring light. You boil wine with spices and sip it slowly while the children sing. It warms your chest but not your hope. The rats have returned. You hear them chewing in the dark. Still, you prepare for Christmas. Not with gifts, there are none. But with pine boughs tied to rafters, with prayers written by candlelight, with bread shaped like swaddled infants. On Christmas Eve, Father Willem places a wooden nativity in the chapel. The Christ child looks serene. You wonder what he would think of your village, of your broken roof, of your aching back. But it is December 27th when death returns. The cough that took your neighbor's daughter in the spring is now in your home. It began with your eldest. A dry wheeze. Then sweat, then silence. You try everything. Heated broth. The wise woman's mint tea. Garlic poultices. Nothing works. On New Year's Eve, your son dies. You bury him under the same tree where your father lies. The ground is frozen, so the grave is shallow. You do not cry. You have no tears left. Only a long exhale, the kind you make when lifting something far too heavy. The year ends not with celebration, but with accounting. The steward visits once more. He marks your debts for the year ahead. You sign again with an X. You begin the new year thinner. Quieter. One child fewer. The same number of tools. The same number of hands. The cycle will begin again. And yet, as you sit by the fire, half asleep, staring into the glowing coals, you wonder. Was your life meaningless, or was it simply unnoticed? You never imagined bread could become an act of rebellion. But in the spring of 1329, in a small market town on the outskirts of Gloucester, England, a loaf of rye bread weighed as heavily on your soul as it did in your hand. It was not just food. It was proof of obedience. Of taxation. Of a system so rigid and petty that even the flour dust on your apron could be considered taxable property. You are a miller's daughter, living in the shadows of cathedral walls and king's laws. Your family owns nothing but the right to grind grain, and even that right is not truly yours. The mill is rented from the Lord. The stone wheels belong to him. Even the water that turns them is considered his gift. And then there is the bread tax. The assize of bread, they call it, a law that has governed bakers for over a century. On its face, it is simple: regulate the price of bread based on the cost of grain, to prevent bakers from cheating the poor. But in practice, it is a maze of fines, inspections, and punishment. The weight of your loaf is recorded. The ingredients scrutinized. If you sell a loaf too light, you pay a fine. Too heavy, and you're suspected of price manipulation. You've seen bakers whipped in the square for using spoiled flour. One woman was pilloried for adding ground peas to stretch her dough. The bread tax is enforced by men in robes who have never baked a loaf in their lives. But the rules are getting worse. In January, a new edict arrives from the town reeve. Every baker must pay a hearth fee, a silver coin for every oven they light. Even the poorest families, who bake only for their own homes, are now expected to pay. This fee is separate from the grain tithe, the milling fee, the salt levy, and the Lord's share. It's called a bread tax, but it's a tax on survival. Your mother, always the quieter one, speaks up at market. She tells the other women that flour belongs to those who grind it, not those who collect it. She's warned. Then fined. Then summoned to the guild hall for questioning. She returns with red eyes and a silent mouth. She never speaks about bread again. So, it falls to you. You learn to bake in the early mornings. You mix dough by candlelight, kneading with hands still numb from sleep. You wait for the village oven to cool, then slide your loaves inside one by one. You mark them with a thumbprint. It is illegal to bake without marking. If your bread is found unmarked, it is confiscated, even if it's still steaming. The bread you bake is not soft. It is dense, crusted, and flecked with bits of grit from the grinding stone. But it is honest bread. And it fills the stomachs of a dozen neighbors, even if it empties your family's purse. Inspections become more frequent. The Guild of Bakers now sends 2 men each week. They carry scales, rulers, and scrolls of numbers. They record your loaves, compare prices to grain costs, and nod gravely at the margins. If a loaf is short in weight by even half an ounce, they fine you. If you refuse to sell bread at the just price, they threaten to revoke your oven rights. But then, the price of grain rises suddenly in March. A late frost has ruined much of the winter barley. The next harvest is months away. Grain merchants from the coast are buying up local stores and selling them back at inflated prices. Your family must now pay twice as much for flour, but the official bread price has not changed. To obey the tax is to go hungry. To defy it is to risk ruin. Your father begins to speak in hushed tones by the fire. He tells you about the bread riots in Bristol years ago, how women overturned carts of spoiled grain, how bakers locked themselves in their shops, how the sheriff's men rode in on horseback and restored order. You ask him what happened to the rioters. He doesn't answer. In April, a widow named Ellsworth is arrested for baking clandestine loaves, round rolls sold out of her home oven. They say she mixed bran into her flour, and sold the bread to children for half the regulated price. She is dragged into the square and tied to the post. Her bread is burned in front of her, as if to teach it a lesson. The smell of scorched rye clings to the air for days. And yet, the people still come. They knock on your door with empty baskets. They whisper their orders, 2 loaves, 1 for the taxman, 1 for the child. You begin baking extra loaves at night, unmarked, hidden under cloth sacks. You trade them for apples, eggs, or simply promises. The townsfolk call them shadow loaves. No one reports you, not yet. But the risk grows. By May, a new steward arrives from the guild. He is younger, sterner, with polished boots and a scroll of warrants. He visits your home. He asks to see your oven. Your records. Your flour sacks. Your father stands behind you with a bent back and clenched fists. The steward leaves without finding the hidden loaves. But as he crosses the street, he pauses, and says, without turning, "When the law controls the bread, it controls the people. But when the bread controls the law, what then?" June brings heat and suspicion. Your hands are blistered, not from baking, but from splitting firewood. You've had to move your oven out back, into the shadow of the trees, where the town reeve is less likely to pass. You don't bake as much now. You bake more often. A few loaves at a time. Enough to survive, never enough to be noticed. The bread tax hasn't changed. But everything else has. The town reeve now posts lists outside the chapel, a rolling ledger of every baker, miller, and grain keeper in the borough. Each name is marked with one of 3 symbols, a heavy check mark for those in compliance, a cross mark for those fined, and a balance scale for those under investigation. Your family is branded with a balance scale. You wonder if the mark is ink or ash. It doesn't matter. Its weight is the same. In the morning, your father visits the grain market with what little coin remains from last autumn's cloth sales. He returns with a sack of barley flour and a warning, the price has risen again. Not because the harvest failed, but because the guild has declared a grain shortage. They've bought up the supply and hidden it behind locked granaries. Artificial scarcity. Forced hunger. Even the priests speak more cautiously now. Father Cedric used to end sermons with jokes about crusts and crumbs. Now, he stares at the floor and recites the Lord's Prayer slowly, as if every daily bread spoken aloud might be overheard by the guild steward. Then, the oven tax is raised. Previously, it was 1 silver coin per month. Now it's 2 or 4 loaves surrendered each week to the reeve's men. They call it in-kind contribution to the maintenance of public order. The loaves are taken straight to the manor house, where they're fed to soldiers and clerks who do no baking of their own. In protest, 3 bakers close their ovens entirely. One leaves town under cover of darkness. Another is arrested for abandoning his obligation to the guild. His tools are confiscated, his home seized, and his youngest child placed in work servitude. You realize then, you are not just baking bread. You are baking evidence. So you begin keeping 2 ledgers. One, marked in clean ink, lists only what you bake for the official market, 6 loaves per week, each within legal weight, each priced precisely to the guild standard. The other is charcoal scribbled, hidden beneath the oven floor. It records the real numbers. The shadow loaves. The secret trades. Flour for eggs. Bread for nettle tea. Crusts for care. Each day, you risk everything, not for profit, but for continuity. Bread is what holds this town together. It fills empty bellies and quiets fearful minds. But it's also becoming a currency of resistance. In mid-July, something strange happens. A loaf appears on the altar at Mass. It is wrapped in linen, unmarked, still warm. Father Cedric says nothing, but his eyes linger on it too long. A few congregants exchange looks. No one claims it. The next week, it happens again. And again. You begin to suspect you are not alone. The Bakers' Guild sends a new inspector. Her name is Mistress Havlin. She is stern, clever, and far more thorough than the stewards before her. She arrives without warning, often at dusk. She measures your flour. She inspects your ash pile. She asks sharp questions, not only about your bread, but about your intentions. Why do you bake so little when your oven could hold more? Why are your loaves always exact? Never 1 ounce under, never 1 ounce over. Why does your dog bark only when I arrive? You answer carefully. Calmly. But each question digs closer to truth. To protect your family, you make a choice. You begin burning old loaves. Once a week, just before sunrise, you place 3 small shadow loaves in the fire. It feels like blasphemy, bread is sacred. But it's safer to destroy food than risk its discovery. You cry the first time. Your mother watches silently, her eyes clouded by smoke and regret. The villagers notice. They begin leaving tiny tributes outside your home, a bunch of radishes, a threadbare scarf, a wedge of cheese wrapped in nettle leaves. You accept them. You say nothing. But you feel the town leaning toward you, not in worship, but in hope. In August, a boy is caught stealing flour from the guild's granary. He is 12. He says he wanted to bake a loaf for his sick grandmother. The town reeve orders 10 lashes. Father Cedric intervenes, offering to pay the boy's fine himself. The reeve refuses, the punishment is carried out in the square. The boy does not cry. But something in the crowd does. That night, as dusk settles over the cobbled streets and the oven bricks radiate their fading heat, you kneel beside the fire and whisper aloud. How long can bread be taxed before it becomes rebellion? By September, the air has changed again, not just in temperature, but in tone. The fields around Gloucester are golden with harvest, but the town feels dry. Brittle. Tense. Every conversation ends in a whisper. Every knock at the door draws silence before it draws an answer. Bread, that most humble of gifts, now carries the weight of defiance. And then, something small breaks the surface. It starts, as revolutions often do, with a missing name. The weekly list posted outside the chapel no longer includes yours. The column where your family's balance scale once stood is now blank. No heavy check mark. No cross mark. No fine. No threat. Just, omission. Others notice. Mistress Havlin is not seen for a week. The Guild of Bakers closes its doors for internal auditing. The reeve speaks at market with forced cheer. And for a moment, a very brief, very silent moment, the town breathes easier. But you are not comforted. Because you know. Power does not disappear. It reorganizes. Sure enough, on the first Sunday of October, a new proclamation is read aloud at Mass. The Guild, it declares, will no longer regulate ovens or individual loaves. Instead, all flour sales must now go through the Unified Bakers Authority, a new body with authority over price, quality, and licensing. Every buyer must register. Every grain tracked. It is not the bread that is taxed now. It is the act of baking itself. At home, you sit in silence. Your father shakes his head slowly. Your mother stares at the fire. You understand what this means. The Guild has abandoned pretense. This is not about fairness. Not about feeding the poor. It is about control. Still, the people adapt. Secret ovens multiply. You learn of a widow who bakes bread inside clay pots buried in the coals of her hearth. A shepherd's wife grinds acorns into flour and bakes thin crisps in the sun. Children trade crusts behind schoolhouse walls like smuggled letters. Bread is no longer food. It is signal. And then, late in October, a miracle happens. A caravan of grain merchants, traveling under royal banner, arrives at the town gate. They've come to collect taxes for the crown, barley, rye, oats, but they carry more than they take. They bring news. In other towns, they say, the bread tax has collapsed. In Kent, bakers refused to light their ovens for a week. In York, the Guild was run out of the hall by a crowd of women armed with rolling pins and brooms. No one in Gloucester cheers. But something shifts in your chest. That night, you light your oven without fear. You bake 6 loaves, round, imperfect, unmarked. You wrap them in linen and place them, quietly, on doorsteps. The next morning, your neighbors return the favor. Loaves appear on your doorstep, sweet ones, burned ones, loaves shaped like fish and birds and saints. You don't ask who baked them. You don't need to. By All Hallows Eve, the reeve posts one final notice. It is brief. Due to non-compliance and increasing disorder, all domestic baking licenses are hereby revoked. All ovens must be extinguished by sunset. It is the last order he ever gives. That night, no one complies. Instead, the sky above Gloucester glows with smoke and warmth. Ovens burn in every alley, cottage, and courtyard. Loaves rise by the hundreds. Children carry baskets to and fro, delivering bread like letters of forgiveness. Old men weep into crusts they haven't tasted in years. The church bells ring, not for mass, but for defiance. The guild hall is found empty the next day. Mistress Havlin's ledgers are gone. The tax scrolls have vanished. A bag of flour sits on the chair where the reeve once sat, no note, just a single loaf placed carefully on top. For weeks afterward, no officials come. The town governs itself quietly. Prices are agreed upon, not enforced. Loaves are still weighed, but out of pride, not fear. The bread is coarse, yes. Uneven. Sometimes underbaked, but it is yours. By December, the flour stores are thinning again. Winter will bring hunger. But it will not bring shame. The bread you bake is not taxed. Not branded. not inspected. It is offered, in silence, in gratitude, in remembrance of the year when bread meant more than law. And as you stand before your oven, hands floured and heart calm, you ask yourself, how long before someone, somewhere, tries to control it all again, and what will you do when they do? In the heart of the countryside, far from the clang of cities and courts, nestled beneath a crooked row of linden trees, lies a village so small it does not appear on any lord's map. No walls surround it. No banners fly above it. There is only the crooked path, the wind over barley fields, and the sound, or once, the sound, of the bell. The bell was not large. It hung in a wooden tower beside the chapel, weathered and half-leaning. It rang every Sunday morning. It rang for weddings, for deaths, for harvests, and for plague. It was the heartbeat of the village, a dull, metallic thrum that echoed across the meadows and down to the stream where the children played. And then, one Sunday in the year 1348, it did not ring. No one noticed at first. The day was foggy, and fog often muffled the sound. People stirred from their cottages, shoulders hunched, expecting the familiar clang to arrive late. But as the sun broke through the mist and the sky cleared, the silence remained. No bell. No sound. Only the whisper of the wind, moving too softly to carry anything but dread. You were 10 years old that morning. Your mother had braided your hair before Mass and your father had mended his boots with pitch. It was the first time you had seen him use oil on his hands, which you later realized meant something serious was expected. But then, with no bell to summon them, the villagers stood in doorways, uncertain. Father Ulrich emerged from the chapel alone, his robes tucked hastily under his belt, his face pale and wet. He looked not toward heaven, but toward the ground, and said only, "There will be no service today. Return home. Lock your doors. God is already here." That evening, the village well was covered. Boards nailed across the stone mouth. A red cloth tied to the pump handle. Your father brought water from the stream. He boiled it before letting anyone drink. He didn't explain why. And the bell still did not ring. The next morning, you found the cooper's dog lying beneath the linden tree. Flies buzzed above its eyes. The cooper himself had not been seen since Thursday. By Wednesday, the village knew. It moved like whispers through the hedgerows, plague. It had come not with shouts, not with banners, but with stillness. The first to fall was the cooper's wife. Then his youngest boy. Then the midwife, who had nursed both. The chapel bell should have tolled for them all, 3 slow clangs, spaced by silence, but it did not. The rope had snapped. No one replaced it. No one dared climb the tower. Weeks passed. The village shrank. First, it was the old, those already weakened by years of labor and meager winters. Then the young, coughing and pale, taken in clusters. Mothers wept in silence. Fathers dug graves by moonlight. The priest came only to windows, offering blessings through wood and glass. You remember the day the baker nailed his door shut from the inside. He had no fever, no cough. Only fear. His chimney remained cold for days. No one knocked. By the first frost of November, only 20 people remained from a village of more than 60. No one rang the bell. No one dared. In its absence, time began to stretch strangely. You lost track of days. Mass was no longer held. Meals came when hunger demanded, not when the sun said so. There was no market. No gatherings. No games. Children whispered through fences, too afraid to come close. Father Ulrich stopped wearing his robes. He no longer gave sermons. Instead, he wandered from house to house, sitting quietly in doorways. He did not offer hope, only presence. He carried a book with no words, only blank parchment. He told you, once, that each blank page was a life that had not yet ended. He never said what happened to the others. Your mother fell ill after the winter solstice. Your father carried her to the chapel steps and left her there, wrapped in linen. He kissed her forehead once, then returned home. The next morning, her body was gone. No one ever spoke of her again. Spring returned, but it brought no celebration. The snow melted, but there were no flowers. No dances around the maypole. The few who remained farmed as best they could, but the fields were quiet. Even the birds seemed to have moved on. One day, your father looked out the window and said, "It's too quiet. The land needs sound." He walked to the chapel tower and stood beneath the bell. He stared up for a long time. Then he left. You never saw him again. You asked Father Ulrich where he went. The priest only looked at the empty rope and said, "Perhaps he went to ring the bell from the other side." By the time summer returned to the village, you had grown accustomed to absence. The air no longer carried the smell of fresh bread or drying herbs. The village square, once a place of quiet barter and occasional laughter, had grown over with weeds. Chickens wandered untended. The chapel door stayed open day and night, not from faith, but because no one remembered to close it anymore. Father Ulrich's steps grew slower. His beard, once neatly trimmed, now spilled down his chest in unruly gray curls. He rarely spoke aloud, muttering instead to his blank book, as if the parchment itself had learned to listen better than people could. You were 12 now, and you did not feel like a child. You remembered your father's hands, thick, calloused, always busy, and his final walk toward the chapel bell. You still went to the tower sometimes, craning your neck upward. The bell remained where it had always hung, but the rope had never been replaced. No one dared to climb the tower. There were rumors, of course. The bell had been cursed, some said. Others believed that ringing it would call the plague back. A few whispered it was the bell itself that had summoned death in the first place, like a beacon lit in the dark that attracted something far worse than wolves or war. You did not believe in curses. But you believed in the silence. And that was enough. One morning, the blacksmith's daughter, a quiet girl named Lisbeth who now lived with the priest, told you something strange. "There's a man in the woods," she said. "He wears no shoes. Carries a rope made of thorns." You stared at her. Lisbeth had grown quieter since her father's death, and more prone to stories. Still, you asked, "Did you see him?" She shook her head. "No. But I heard him. He hums the bell's tone when he walks. Low and slow. Like he's calling someone." You laughed nervously. "There's no man like that." Lisbeth only looked toward the trees and said, "Not anymore." That night, you dreamt of the chapel bell. In your dream, it rang once, a deep, earth-shaking sound, and then kept ringing without end, echoing through your skull until you woke up gasping. You weren't alone. Others had heard it too. In the days that followed, people spoke of phantom ringing, soft tones in the distance, just at the edge of hearing. Sometimes it came from the woods, sometimes from underground, sometimes from inside their homes. It was always the same tone, doom. Silence. Doom. Father Ulrich grew agitated. He began tearing pages from his blank book and burning them in the chapel hearth. He said nothing, only sat before the flames muttering, "Too many blank pages. Not enough names. Then, one morning, the door of the chapel was found sealed. Not locked, nailed shut. A note pinned to the wood with a butcher's knife read. The bell has already rung. You just didn't hear it. No one knew who wrote it. Lisbeth said the thorn man had come. You began to notice strange things. The well, boarded years ago, had been unsealed. Footprints, bare and oddly spaced, were found in the mud. Animals refused to go near the chapel. Then, the bell moved. It was only by inches, a tilt, a sway, but you saw it. So did the others. A few claimed the bell had rung once during the night. A low sound, more felt in the bones. Then heard. Father Ulrich refused to go near it. He moved into the old bakery, living among flour sacks and broken millstones. He said the tower had become a passage now, that it no longer reached toward God, but down into something much older. You didn't understand what he meant. But then, one by one, people started to leave. They didn't say goodbye. They simply vanished. Some were found days later, wandering the road in a daze. Others were never seen again. A few scrawled messages on doors before departing, strange warnings in Latin or symbols you didn't recognize. One read. Not every silence is empty. By autumn, fewer than 10 villagers remained. Lisbeth stopped speaking entirely. She carried twine with her now, weaving it through her fingers like a net. When asked what she was making, she said, a noose for the sky. You were left alone in your family's cottage. You cooked, cleaned, and watched the chapel bell through the window. One evening, you saw a figure climb the tower. Not the thorn man. Not your father. It was Father Ulrich. He moved slowly, leaning on a cane, step by painful step. You held your breath as he reached the platform and stood before the bell. For a moment, he only looked at it. Then, with trembling hands, he took a new rope, one woven of old altar cloths and shoelaces, and tied it to the bell's iron tongue. He didn't pull it. He only sat beside it and waited. The bell swayed in the wind. And still, it did not ring. That night, Father Ulrich did not come down. You waited. Each day, you woke and looked toward the bell tower. Father Ulrich remained at the top, unmoving. You sometimes saw him rise and pace or sit hunched beside the bell, as though listening. But he never rang it. And he never came down. Lisbeth said he was guarding something now, not from us, but from getting out. The last few villagers stayed indoors. Through the valley. The forest path had grown thick, choked with vines and nettles, as though the land itself had decided to keep people out. One night, a storm rolled in, the first real thunder in years. It broke over the hills like a war drum, and the rain fell so hard it stripped the moss from stones and turned paths into rivers. You awoke to a sound. The bell. It rang once. Low. Long trembling. And then, silence. You ran into the street. The village was already awake. Doors opened. Candles flickered. For the first time in what felt like years, voices were raised, fearful, frantic. A few brave souls gathered at the chapel. The door had been torn open. The nails scattered like teeth across the threshold. Inside, everything was as it had always been, the pews, the altar, the dust. But the air felt wrong. Thicker. Still. A trail of wet footprints led up the tower steps. You and Lisbeth followed. At the top, you found nothing. No Father Ulrich. No rope. The bell stood silent, unmoved, its iron tongue motionless. But the floor was soaked, as if someone had stood there in the rain for hours. That night, the remaining villagers met in the bakery and made a decision: no more waiting. No more bell. The tower was boarded. The rope, found days later in the woods twisted into a perfect spiral, was burned. A ring of salt was poured around the chapel. Lisbeth stood watch for a week, holding her twine net. Then she, too, disappeared. Not gone, just silent. She wandered through the village like a shadow. She no longer spoke, no longer blinked. You once saw her standing beneath the bell tower at midnight, head tilted, listening. You called her name. She did not respond. Later, you found a string net hanging in your window. Woven perfectly, it shimmered in the morning light like frost. You were the last one now. The others had left or faded into silence. You kept the fire lit. You boiled rainwater. You recited your name each night so you would not forget it. And still, the bell remained. Not ringing. Not silent. Present. You began to hear it in your sleep again. Not the ringing itself, but the anticipation, the pause before a toll. The hush before thunder. A silence so heavy it had its own sound. You wondered what would happen if you rang it again. Would it bring back the village? Or bury it forever? One morning, you climbed the tower. Each step felt longer than the last. At the top, the wind howled through the broken shutters. The bell hung still, gray and waiting. The platform creaked beneath your feet. You touched the bell. It was cold, not the cold of metal, but the cold of absence. As though it had forgotten what warmth was. You stood there, hand on iron, eyes closed. And then you heard it. Not the bell. Not thunder. A whisper. You have always been waiting. You opened your eyes. There was no one there. Only the empty village below, and the endless hush of the world around it. You stepped back from the bell. And for the first time, you understood. It was never meant to be rung again. Not because of a curse. But because silence was the only answer that remained. The bell had already done its work. Now, it simply waited, like you. Not to be heard. But to be remembered.